AP Psychology, the Learning Unit. Learning is defined as a relatively permanent change in an organism's behavior due to experience, and that should also be extended to include a change in thinking, although thinking, of course, is a form of behavior. Associative learning is one of the basic forms of learning as we've seen in class through classical and operant conditioning. This is something which thinkers, scientists, philosophers have realized for thousands of years, going back to and including Aristotle 2,000 years ago and John Locke and David Hume 200 years ago. Two people, or three people rather, whom you might have encountered in your philosophy class if you're taking philosophy. So the idea that we learn through association is nothing new, but the scientific understanding of it is something that's really only come about in the last 100 to 120 years or so. So here we have two situations. We have a very simple organism, a sea snail, associating a splash with a tail shock. So the first event leads to the second event, and the sea snail, with whatever size brain it has, learns to understand that. Whereas a slightly more sophisticated, or not slightly, but actually quite a bit more sophisticated animal, the seal, learns to expect a snack for its showy antics. And as you see in the one case, with the sea snail, we're close to the situation of classical conditioning, and with the seal, we're very close to the situation of operant conditioning. So classical or Pavlovian conditioning, as we saw in class and saw in action and worked on a little activity regarding. The key thing is to remember regarding classical conditioning is that it is always reflexive. We have no control over the response. So if somebody shines a light in our eyes, our pupils are going to constrict and we're probably going to blink. If the heat is up too high, we're going to sweat. If we are getting nervous, then our mouths are going to get dry. These are all reflexive responses to natural situations, which can also be classically conditioned through the process of combining, as you saw in class, a neutral stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus leading to a conditioned response. Operant conditioning works the other way around, whereas with classical conditioning, we deal with stimulus and response, or that is to say, a dog smelling food and then salivating in response to it, and then later on hearing the sound of a bell and salivating in response to it. With operant conditioning, we first have the response that we want, for example, a pigeon turning around, and then the pigeon gets the food pellet that it's been looking for, or a rat pressing a lever gets the result of a food pellet or some other kind of tasty treat or pleasurable item in the rat's view. Key thing to remember with operant conditioning when it comes to reinforcement is that reinforcement, or a key thing, not the only key thing, is that reinforcement is designed to strengthen or increase the likelihood that a behavior will occur, whereas punishment is always designed to decrease the likelihood or weaken a behavior, decrease the likelihood that a behavior will occur. Pavlov, you know, as we discussed in class, is sort of the godfather of classical conditioning, and he didn't even start out with wanting to know anything about learning. He wanted to study digestive processes, but stumbled across classical conditioning as a sort of as a byproduct of his research. And here we see a resume, as we discussed in class, of Pavlov's experiments with dogs. Key thing to remember here, we reinforce in class and has been stressed in your textbook, is that the neutral stimulus always becomes the conditioned stimulus. The neutral stimulus means that the neutral stimulus produces no relevant response. In this case, the relevant response is the salivation. Of course, if a dog hears a bell or a tuning fork, it might prick up its ears or look at the tuning fork, but that's not the response we're looking to get. We're looking to get salivation. That is the relevant response. So neutral just means that it produces no relevant response. That is to say, not the response that we're interested in. And you saw this. Some of you were grossed out by it. Pavlov's device for recording salivation. Little graduated test tube attached to the side of the dog's mouth. So in classical conditioning, an organism comes to associate two stimuli, and a neutral stimulus that signals an unconditioned stimulus begins to produce a response that anticipates and prepares for the unconditioned stimulus. And this is what's called conditioning or learning. Watson is another prime example of classical conditioning, and he's famous, or rather infamous, for his experiments with baby Albert, which we won't discuss in detail here because by our standards today, they're pretty disgusting and cruel. But you will see them described in your textbook, and you're welcome to search YouTube for examples. In classical conditioning, as we said before, we have an unconditioned stimulus. That is a stimulus that unconditionally or automatically and naturally triggers a response. So bright light, we get a constriction of the pupil. Too much heat, we get sweating and so on. That's something over which we have no control, which is the unconditioned response. Pupil constriction to bright light is an unconditioned response, and perspiration is an unconditioned response to too much heat. A conditioned stimulus is a stimulus which at first produces no relevant response, such as the bell or the tuning fork in the case of the Pavlov's dogs. The neutral stimulus always becomes the conditioned stimulus, but the conditioned response is always the same as the unconditioned response. The difference is in the stimulus. So the dog will always salivate in response to the smell of food before conditioning. Then after conditioning, the dog will salivate to the sound of the bell or whatever stimulus has been combined with the food. And here you see a brief resume of the process of acquisition in classical conditioning. And we looked at this example of combining onion breath with a kiss in class, and how that response can be classically conditioned. And conditioning or learning can also be extinguished. A conditioned response can be diminished over time if, in the case of Pavlov's dogs, the food was not combined with the bell. Then eventually the dog's conditioned response would be eliminated. In operant conditioning, this happens when a response is no longer reinforced. The pigeon is no longer going to turn around in a circle if it does not receive a food pellet after a period of time. And here you can see a graph indicating the acquisition of classical and extinction of classical conditioning and spontaneous recovery. And more of the same. Remember that generalization of a stimulus, for example, if you have been conditioned to fear a white rat, then you may also fear other small white animals, such as cats, or mice, or whatever other small animal you might encounter. You've generalized the fear response to the white rat to those other small animals. Discrimination involves being able to tell the difference between two similar stimuli so that the response doesn't happen. For example, a dog has been classically conditioned to salivate at the sound of a bell, might only salivate to the sound of a certain tone, the bell, certain pitch, and not salivate to another tone or pitch of a given bell. Here's a graph showing that situation with generalization. And a situation of nausea conditioning in cancer patients. Drug which is used to treat cancer become associated with the environment of the doctor's office or the hospital, and the cancer patient may learn to or be conditioned to feel nausea simply in the presence of the hospital or the doctor's office, not actually when the drug is administered. Operant conditioning is voluntary, whereas classical conditioning is reflexive. By voluntary, we don't mean necessarily that a pigeon or a rat is making a decision about something, although I suppose we can't get exactly inside the pigeon's or the rat's head and saying they're not making a decision. The point is that operant conditioning is not reflexive. There is control over the response. And the operant behavior teaches or conditions an organism to realize that there are consequences to certain kinds of behavior. Do the right thing, you get a juicy, tasty food pellet. Do the wrong thing, you might receive an electric shock. Skinner is the godfather of operant conditioning, as we discussed in class, and you saw some video footage of his experiments with rats and pigeons, and his explanation of operant conditioning, particularly as it applies to the human behavior of gambling, which is one of the most important aspects of his research. But also, we did an activity regarding operant conditioning to sort out the terminology, especially the difference between negative reinforcement and punishment. And it's crucial that you understand the difference between those two terms. See here an example of Skinner's operant chamber. Not Skinner himself working on it, somebody else from the 1980s. A reinforcer is any event that strengthens a certain kind of behavior. And shaping is the operant conditioning procedure in which reinforcers guide behavior toward closer approximations of a desired goal. And you encounter this all the time in school. For example, if a teacher is trying to teach you how to write an essay, then the teacher might start out with how to construct an introductory paragraph first, and then might actually fast forward to the concluding paragraph for the essay, and then teach you step by step in between how to construct the body of the essay. It's an example of shaping. You don't try to teach the whole thing at once. You break it down into steps so that you achieve the target behavior, which is writing a coherent and well thought out essay. You see a table of ways to increase behavior. Remember, positive and negative in this context doesn't mean good or bad, or those terms don't mean good or bad. In the case of positive reinforcement, it just means that a stimulus has been added to the environment. In the negative reinforcement, a stimulus has been withdrawn. In the case of positive reinforcement, the stimulus is going to likely be something pleasurable. In negative reinforcement, the stimulus is going to be something unpleasant. Primary reinforcer, something like water or food, satisfies a biological need. So we get thirsty, we drink water, and we learn that drinking water relieves the thirst. We're more likely to go back and drink water again. Now, or in the case of eating food, we eat the food and we feel satisfied. We're more likely to eat food again. You ask yourself, well, isn't that really classical conditioning? Isn't that a reflex behavior? No, it's not, because some people can choose not to have a drink when they're thirsty. Some people, in fact, people who are eating disordered, choose to starve themselves. So it's not a reflex behavior. It might be a natural behavior, it's true, but it's not a reflex behavior. Condition reinforcer is something like the gold star on the spelling test that your teacher gave you in grade 3. It doesn't satisfy a biological need, but it makes you feel very, very good. And pay for work is the same kind of thing. You don't directly need the pay for the work you do to survive. Of course, it does end up buying food for you, but it's really nice to have, and it would still be a secondary reinforcer, so it doesn't satisfy a biological need. In terms of schedules of reinforcement, you'll notice that intermittent is misspelled there. It should be 2 T's after the I. In the case of schedules of reinforcement, as we saw in the activity in class, the way to make sure that a certain behavior is going to be repeated or reinforced or strengthened is the variable ratio schedule of reinforcement. This is the schedule of reinforcement on which gambling is based. So everything that goes on at Casino-Rama, buying a lottery ticket and so on, is always based on a variable ratio schedule of reinforcement. The organism, the person, whoever it is, knows that the reinforcer is going to come at some point, but they don't know exactly when, and therefore they are more likely to continue the behavior. So in the case of the gambler, he's going to continue wasting his money, figuring that eventually he's going to win. And in the case of the rat who's pressing the bar for the food pellet, when they realize that they are going to get something at some point, they probably press the lever for the food pellet much more rapidly than they would if they were to realize that it's going to happen only at certain intervals, or it's going to happen with a certain ratio of responses. For example, 5 bar presses for 1 pellet, or 1 pellet every 1 minute, or some other similar schedule of reinforcement. And here you see the results of what I just talked about, laid out in a handy graph for you. Punishment is any stimulus that is designed or intended to reduce or to curtail a certain form of behavior. As we discussed in class, for long-term changes in the behavior of human beings anyway, it's much more effective to reinforce the behavior you do want rather than to punish the behavior you don't want. That doesn't mean you do not use punishment. Punishment is perfectly appropriate and necessary in some cases. There are some people whose behavior deviates so far from the norm in terms of violence and antisociality that we have no choice but to lock them up away from the rest of us. But in the case of the average, well-intentioned, well-adjusted human being, if you really want to get long-term changes in their behavior, you reward or reinforce the desired behavior rather than punish the undesired behavior. And here you see the 2 different kinds of punishment, as far as Skinner is concerned, laid out for you. If punishment has to be used, the most humane one of the 2 is negative punishment. Physical abuse will get short-term results, but has negative long-term consequences. Pavlov and Skinner held sway for a long time until people began to realize that classical and operant conditioning had wide application but oversimplified the way organisms and specifically human beings learn, and therefore other researchers got into the act, and we saw this this with a couple of examples in class of the cognitive map and latent learning, where the behavior is not reinforced and it's not conditioned. A rat, for example, will navigate a maze and will then go off to sleep and process the navigation of the maze while asleep, and then come back and navigate the maze more quickly than it did the day before, and has not been reinforced in any way in doing this. Latent learning, we didn't discuss in detail in class, but it is discussed in your textbook. Latent learning is the kind of learning that occurs along the way, but we're not intending to learn that information. For example, you might move into a new neighborhood and make a new friend, and you decide that you're going to get together and play video games one afternoon. And so your friend gives you directions to his or her house. And on the way to his or her house, you notice that you pass a park and you pass a variety store, and you see various other items on the way, which you're not intending to see, but you pick them up along the way, and eventually you reach your friend's house. And then later on, as you're going to your friend's house a few days later for another round of video games, somebody along the way asks you if you know where there's a variety store, and of course you do, because you passed it on your way to your friend's house. Your objective wasn't to find out where the variety store is, your objective was to find your friend's house. But you picked up the knowledge of the variety store along the way, and that's what's called latent learning. Latent learning is learning that happens behind the scenes when you're actually trying to learn something else. The overjustification effect happens when behavior is reinforced too often. And what people start to work for more than anything else is the reward rather than the intrinsic interest in a given activity. For example, professional athletes report this as they get closer to retirement. They will tell, in some cases anyway, they'll tell people that the game is no longer fun, and the only reason they were playing for the past couple of years was to get the paycheck. That's an example of the overjustification effect, and of course they're making the right decision to retire if the game is no longer fun. Most pro athletes will tell you that they enjoy playing the game as a pro just as much as they did when they were in high school or in university. But of course now they're being paid in most cases millions upon millions of dollars to do so. They would probably play the game for much less money, but of course they're in the lucky position of being able to command a much larger paycheck than the average working person is. However, the point is that their original interest in the game came from simply loving to play the game. The musician loving to play music. The artist loving to sculpt or loving to paint pictures. Now what you have to ask yourself is, for the various courses you're taking in school, are you doing them just for the marks that you hope to receive, or are you doing them because you are genuinely interested in the content? Because you are more likely to retain the content if you are really interested in it, no matter how hard you study, as opposed to just trying to get the reward of a high mark and studying solely for that reason. We'll talk about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation more when we come to the motivation and emotion unit. And here you have your handy chart comparing classical and operant conditioning, which is reproduced in your textbook, or something similar to it is in there. And we also looked at observational learning, particularly when it comes to the Bobo doll experiments, and modeling, referencing the Bobo doll experiments as well. Prosocial behavior we'll talk more about when we come to the psychological disorders unit. Don't worry about mirror neurons right now. They're a huge controversy, and we're not going to consider them, at least for the time being.